I don't have the information, but what kind of uh, triggered this, I guess, are two things. First of all, this is the approach that is part of the Amplio, what we call the Amplio GPS, how you decide what's needed at an organization. But the State of Agile last year showed some very interesting results where people were moving away from frameworks. They were down about half, which is dramatic. I've never seen that before. And there were something like 22% who were saying they created their own, and 12%, I may be inverting these numbers. Yeah, I think it's 12% said they created their own, and 22% said they didn't use anything. But the ones who don't use anything, I think, are really just going ad hoc. So that's not necessarily a good thing. But it does show that there's a shift, and I think it's good that there's this shift. And the question is, how do you move forward without predetermined frameworks? And I have not been a fan of frameworks for, I don't remember when it happened, but a very long time, well over a decade. Uh, One of the reasons I did go to DA or PMI with the discipline Agile is DA is not a framework. A lot of people think of it that way, but it's really organized collection of practices created in a way that is about how you choose your way of working. It's quite useful. Amplio and the way I've worked for a long time has always been you collect and create something that works. So what we have here, we're going to go through this and show how to move forward without predetermined frameworks. And it's important to recognize that frameworks are predetermined, at least the ones that are out there. There are other kinds of frameworks that I'll actually introduce, what I call an adaptive framework, which is just a way of thinking about how you're working at the moment. And that's not bad. I don't see any problem with that. But just to give a little background for me, I was not at the original Agile Manifesto in 2001, but I was at the 10-year anniversary. And I think I was invited to that because of my influence with Kanban. I had co-formed Lean Kanban University. I'm no longer active there because I'm actually not a fan of any approach that identifies itself with a particular way of doing things. Amplio does not. It's integrated on lean flow theory constraints, human-centered development. If it's useful, believe me, I'll put it in there, or I'll point to it. I'm not sure Swarm is in there, or Scarf rather is in there, but I like Scarf, so I refer to it. It's a good method of looking at people. So I'm a big believer in taking a scientific and engineering approach to things. You see what works and you don't defend your own. And when somebody says this doesn't work, you say, well, thank you. I can now improve it. And fortunately, this doesn't seem to happen much. I do know a few people who do this. Peter Merrill of Xscale and Wolfram Mueller of Blue Dolphin are two that are really good. And there are a lot of individuals. I mean, lots of individuals do this. Yes, I mean when I say there aren't that many, I mean people who have actually created an approach that other people can use. Okay, so let's just start with the advantages contrasted with the reality of predetermined frameworks. I want you to rethink this or at least be open to what could happen. So they're quicker to start with, absolutely. But it's not if an approach that's not, I mean, other approaches can provide quick start. So that's an advantage, but it's not at all unique. Clarity on how to work together. You don't need a framework for this either. Kanban isn't the framework. Kanban, one of the things I liked about it so much when I first started using it, one of the things I proclaimed about what was so good about it. And David Anderson and I both came to this conclusion. The number one thing about Kanban, this was back in 2009 when we started getting some flack from the Scrum folks, was visibility, explicit workflow. We thought that's, and I still do, talking about how people work together is very important, and having it be explicit is very important. So that's one way of getting clarity on what people are doing. Everyone's on the same page. Yes, people need to know how to work together, but not necessarily work in the same way. This is something that's been ignored. Yes, the organization as a whole, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about systems thinking today, definitely needs to know how you work across teams. But within a team, yes, they get to work how they want. But this dual nature of how do you work across teams versus how do you work in a team, very important and is somewhat ignored in the agile space. It's just like we pretend that that's, oh, just roll out everything the same way. And both frameworks do this in a similar way. Scrum takes let's build teams and let's scale them up. They're not scale the teams, but let's build Scrum teams together. SAFe creates the whole big picture and then says, well, there's actually ironically a little more choice in SAFe because you can do Scrum or SAFe or Kanban at the team level. But a disadvantage of predefined frameworks is they rarely are fit for purpose because they're predefined. Duh. I mean, you're not looking at what's you needed in the situation you're in. So let's look at what we need in a framework. There are four aspects that are very important. There's what. What do we need to do from an outcome point of view? In other words, what are the results we want? Why do we need to do this? Like, why is, we might say, well, we need to do some sort of planning. Well, why? So people can know what they're doing and coordinate together. How do we do this? Well, it could be big room planning, could be planning based on little increments of value, can be a flow-based planning, can be sprint planning. It could be any number of ways. What's appropriate for your situation? And then you actually, this is forgot to convey this. Not everybody's going to know this. This idea that there's common sense out there is, well, common sense means it's common. It doesn't mean it's right. I don't know where this comes that common sense is right. You may not need planning. That's a great point, Jeff. No, you may not need planning so people know what they're doing. You may not need to look ahead. That's the whole point. That's the kind of planning. We don't plan ahead. Oh, good. So I appreciate that. That's my point. But you might need it. That was an example. So I appreciate the correction. That's exactly the point. That maybe some of these things we think we need, we don't need. I was just thinking of an example of something that varied a lot, but you're absolutely right. Maybe that's not even needed. Maybe the way you plan, quote unquote, is just take the next thing off and we don't plan. And then everybody knows that. That could be quite useful. So a few years ago when I started Success Engineering and I was doing the Amplio Development Masterclass, everybody was always asking me, well, how do I get people to understand this? And I realized that having a great workshop that gave you all sorts of cool stuff, but didn't tell people how to convey it to others wasn't very useful. It's not useful for the leads to know what to do if they can't convey it to everybody else. So this convey is as important to me as the what, why, and how. And well, just going through this a little bit more, what is make it clear what the goal is from an objective. Okay. The outcomes over output, we need to discuss objectives over the how. The why is this motivates people. People can actually fill in the gaps when they know what they're doing and why they're doing what they're doing. How depends on what situation you're in. Maybe planning is something that you may or may not do. How teams are organized is something you may or may organize different ways. And then convey it. These are all important. And you need to take responsibility when it isn't taken. This is another thing I kind of hate in this industry is I see so many coaches complaining about how the people who are using their method don't understand it, like they had nothing to do with it. Well, maybe they personally didn't have anything to do with it, but if the method is misunderstood, the owners, the curators of that method should be doing something about it. And if you're teaching it, you should talk to them. And yet I never see this. And I don't see that. I shouldn't say never, but I almost never see this. I can't remember when I've ever seen it. Let me put it that way. To me, that's an abdication of responsibility. These all work together, obviously. If any part of this is missing, you're not going to be successful. So what we need is this how, what, and why, and not blame people. And but it should be led with what, why, and how, or why, what, and how, but not how. Predetermined frameworks are about how. And that's not where to lead from. And I think this is a huge problem. And I think this is why a lot of problems are happening in the in the industry, and why people are having difficulties. Now, I want to explain a couple of pieces here, and then I'm going to get into. So I'm not going to talk about Scrum and SAFe too much, but I want to look at the frameworks that are out there and understand why they're based on false premises. And we need to do a different way. We need to do something different. So Scrum has a quest for simplicity. So they focus on the how, because how is really easy to do. You just explain here, do this, do this, do this, do this, do this, do this. But it makes understanding difficult. In fact, you hear it said, follow until you understand. Well, actually, if you can't understand right at the beginning, there's a problem. I'll admit, a couple of times where people just said, hey, look, we really want you to just tell us what to do. So I did it. But I'm talking about in literally hundreds of workshops. That happened only once or twice. Most of the time, I was always explaining, why you're doing, what you're trying to accomplish, and how. Now, a lot of people don't like that. And a lot of those people didn't come to me, I'll admit. But I would shift sometimes when I need to. And I shift now. I teach it both ways. But if you want to be told the how, at least understand why. Because if you're not, it makes it difficult. It means the hows that are presented are not as appropriate to the team as other ways. Almost always. There are not predefined practices that work everywhere. We know this, but yet we see them. Now, the question is, what is a practice? So I've heard it said that, well, Scrum doesn't have any practices. Scrum just tells you to do sprint planning. It doesn't tell you how to do sprint planning. Well, I would say sprint planning is a kind of practice. It's just not precisely defined. But there are lots of ways to do planning or not even do planning. So I'm not talking about the specific implementation as it's still saying a how at a higher level, perhaps. Okay. So SAFe, on the other hand, said, well, we're going to tell you how to do everything. Well, the problem with this, it makes it cumbersome, as people have complained. To me, the problem isn't the cumbersomeness. It's two things. One is it's ironically still incomplete. People don't point this out, that it mostly organizes you into agile release trains. You don't have ways of decomposing those. You don't have ways of taking away the dependencies across the release trains. So it's still incomplete. And because anything that's big, if you don't know the what and the why, there are going to be gaps. See, if you have what and why, then, and if you have a method to see that there are alternative approaches, then you can substitute an alternative approach because you know what you're doing and why you're doing it. So just find something else that does that and why it meets the what and the why, it just does the how differently. But the how is left out, and this is really critical. Okay. If you focus on the how, you don't necessarily get the what and the why. Now, the people who are training it, maybe they know, but the people who are hearing it don't get it. This is why you hear complaints about like, oh, we didn't mean to turn into feature factories. Well, we were told to build features, so we're working on features. So people start doing the hows without understanding. Okay, are there any questions about this? I'm very happy if you interject with questions. If you can raise your hand or raise your hand, let me call on you to make it clear. I think I've got everybody up here. But just please do. Hopefully this is fairly clear from your own experience. Now, the problem I see is that good trainers, regardless of the method they're using, they understand the what and the how and all that, and they and the why, and they can answer questions, but people aren't started with it. And I think this is a big problem. Okay. So this is what I'm suggesting. You need a set of objectives to create effective business agility. What are the objectives? Like, maybe I need to understand what the executive stakeholders' values and success criteria is. Maybe I need to understand the priorities of the organization, like what's our strategy? Maybe I need to understand how to organize people. Maybe I need to understand that building in small steps is good. What's the next small step I can do? That's what I mean by objectives. Okay. A method for telling how to implement which one of these, like planning. I'll just keep harping on that. Maybe we don't plan. Maybe we don't need to plan. Maybe we do need to plan. Maybe we plan a week in advance. Maybe we do big room planning, which is like a month, 2, 3 months out in advance with everybody present. Those would be different ways. Well, how do I know which one's better? How can I tell? There's a group of people in the community that believe you can't. Well, I disagree with that. And I'm not alone. Ellie Goldratt, and I'll bring him in, Creator Theory Constraints, talks about what he calls inherent simplicity, where there are a few factors governing things. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. You can definitely come up with this method. Sorry. Don Reinertson provides 175 principles in his principle, let's see, lean product development, no, flow, principles of flow, second generation product lean develop. Sorry, principles of flow, second generation lean product development by Don Reinertson. 175 principles. Tom Gilb has written extensively on how you can tell what's going on, and so there are a lot of people who actually have the opinion you can tell which is better for others, and that's important. And I'm going to illustrate that. And there's more on our website because it's a lot to do in just a couple of minutes. I'm going to show you. And of course, you need somebody who knows how to do this. This is why I have what I call the ACES program, which is a way that teaches you how. And it borrows from all sorts of disciplines on this. So what do we mean by an objective? It's a statement about what we want to achieve without saying how. It's the what without the how. That's an objective. Okay. Should include the why, because you can't get clear enough about what if you don't know why. See, why is the motivation? And this is what's also important. If you don't have the two of these, don't expect to be understood. You're not going to be understood, because what can be misunderstood. But when you give the why, that gives you a little bit more of a navigation, like a true north. It should also include the issues or forces you have to deal with to determine which implementation would be best for a particular situation. Like, how many people are involved? How far out can we see? What is the culture of the organization? How is management prepared? All sorts of factors. That sounds like a lot, and it is. Now, if we add a name to identify this, it sounds a lot like the structure of Christopher Alexander's patterns, and I'm going to talk about him. Those of you who've known me probably should not be surprised. I'm going to talk about inherent simplicity and patterns. And also, I'll bring in Ross Acuff, because I believe these all give us a different way to look at the problem, and I've talked about that in the past. Now, it's not a coincidence, okay? So Alexander, I'm going to refer to two books. And by the way, this is probably my favorite book, period. And it's a great book. Personally, if you're going to buy a house and you read this book, you will see houses differently than you saw before. In fact, I remember when my wife and I moved and we were looking at getting a house. I said, honey, I want you to read this book. Now, she's not a technical person. We used to be called the high tech, high touch. She's gotten a little bit more techy, but not as much. She was a massage therapist, a school counselor. I'm been what I am, you know who I am, what I've done. But I wanted her to read this book because it explains how things interact with each other, and it included a part on houses, although it was also a lot more. And in Alexander's work, he talks about how you build systems, and this is what's very important. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Andrew. How buildings learn is amazing and is incredibly valuable to the Agile space. And surprisingly so to me. I just read it because I like architecture. But I was really surprised. In fact, that's where I got my single, double, and triple loop explanations learning from. So anyway, with Alexander, it's known as they're known as solutions to recurring problems. It's not quite how he talks about it, but what's really interesting is on page 545 of this 549-page book, he says at this final stage, the patterns are no longer important. They've taught you to be receptive to what's real. Now, I joke in my design patterns classes, well, why did you tell me that at the beginning? I wouldn't be reading an almost 600-page book on patterns. But the reality is I knew this. Yeah, and you know this when you read it, because what's important is the patterns are they're not really recipes, but they're kind of illustrations. What's real is all the stuff that's around them. So to really understand what is real in a short, without having to read the first 544 pages, which could be interesting, I'm going to talk about systems thinking a little bit. Now, by the way, one thing I want to point out about this book, I highly, highly, highly recommend it. It's my top book to recommend. It will change how you design. It will change how you approach problems. Is about 20% of it is italicized. Read that part first. Go through it. Read the italicized part. Takes you an hour or two. I'm a slow reader. It took me a couple hours. Then you go back and read it casually and reflect on it as you go. It's a brilliant book. So let's reflect on systems thinking, because systems thinking and Alexander's approach are very consistent. Okay, I love Ross Acuff. He's got so much great stuff, still very relevant. There are other great systems thinkers out there, Peter Senge, John Gall, but Acuff seems to me to be a bit more accessible. I think that's why I like him. So he talks about systems are defined by the relationships between the components, not the components themselves. This is critical. It's not, do I have this team or that team, but how do the teams relate to each other? That's more important. So whether a team is doing Scrum and another team is doing Scrum is not important. How they relate to each other is important. This kind of gets lost. And an example he uses, if you take the best parts of the best cars, put them together, you don't have a car, you have a pile of junk. See here, these will all work together because they were designed together. But take the engine out of some other car, it won't work here. Take the transmission out of some other car, it won't work here, even if it's the best transmission in the world. You cannot create systems by combining pieces. Yet that's how frameworks are defined, pretty much. Doesn't work well. Carness exists in the system as a whole. Okay, now here's the other book. I told you he wrote 2 books. Now, a pattern language, I got a confession here. A pattern language and timeless way of building were actually written as 2 parts of the same book. And I've read them both. But I don't really like this book so much. I mean, it's great. It's fabulous. And I think you probably should read it too. But the timeless way of building is more the theory and the concepts and all that. And this is how it is an example of how it all works together. So this is also very useful. For some reason, this has been more popular. If you read one, read Timeless Way of Building, and then read this later as you like. And it'll give you a lot of deeper understanding. It'll also give you lots of patterns. I don't know how many exactly, 273 or something like that. But here's what I want to talk about. And he does talk about this in this book. So this is, I didn't actually get this from reading this book, but I got it from Timeless Way of Building, but he really emphasizes it. So I pulled some quotes from here. Each pattern describes a problem which occurs over and over again in our environment, and then describes the core of the solution to that problem. So he is giving us a solution, but he's not saying exactly how, in such a way that you can use this solution a million times over without ever doing it the same way twice. In other words, he's telling us kind of what to do, not how, because he's giving us lots of ways it can be done. So it's been paraphrased that the patterns are solutions to recurring problems in a context. So he doesn't actually have a formalized way of describing patterns, although the Design Patterns book, which kind of introduced patterns to the Agile community, Gammett, Helms, Johnson, and Lacides wrote a book called Design Patterns, Elements of Reusable Object-Oriented Software. They called it a pattern as a solution to a recurring problem in a context. It's got a name to identify it, an objective, the what, a why this is important, the problem to overcome, different ways to implement the solution, how, and forces or issues. These have to be attended to determine the best way. Notice there's not a predetermined solution here. We're not talking about patterns as predetermined solutions. A lot of people think of them as these implementations. There's a big misunderstanding of things. So it's not a recipe, but it's kind of like, hey, you want some great lasagna because you want this, and it gives you different ways of building it, so to speak, gives you flexibility. But here's the real interesting thing. Remember, told us patterns aren't important. Then what is? What is important? If it's not just the forces and the issues, well, it turns out the structure is what's important. Patterns as solutions is useful. But more useful is you can define a system based on how they relate to each other. This is what I do when I teach patterns, design patterns, is how do you create systems? How do you do advanced architecture? When I was at Net Objectives, I was the CEO and one of the lead technical developers there until I handed it off to some other really wonderful people. And if you need training, I know really, really good people who can do that. And we taught how to combine patterns, but we didn't do it in the normal way of doing it. We looked at the whole and then decomposed it in the way Alexander talks about. How do you define a system based on the patterns relate to each other? This is shades of car parts are how do they relate to each other? Systems are how the pieces relate to each other. So Alexander's approach to design is to look at the whole and decompose it into its components, creating clarity on the relationship between the components. Because remember, it's the relationships that are important, not the components that are important. So if we continue, in short, no pattern is an isolated entity. In the same way, no team is an isolated entity. Saying an individual, going into companies and saying, oh, we're going to do Scrum at the team level, or we're going to do Kanban at the team level is nonsense. It's insane. Because no pattern, like think of a team, how a team is working as a pattern. It's a bigger one. Each pattern can exist in the world only to the extent that it's supported by other patterns. How does it fit in? The larger patterns in which it is embedded. Patterns of the same size that surround it, and the smaller patterns which are embedded in it. Now he uses a town, so it could be like you got the town, you got the the central main square, you've got the roads, how do they all fit together? In our case, it could be the PMO create something if you have one. It could be the way, how does product management relate to the teams? How does ops relate to development? How do the different teams in development relate to each other? See, there's these bigger questions, not the pieces. Now, yes, this is a little harder to think. I acknowledge this. I think that's why I'm not as popular as maybe I'd like to be, because I'm taking kind of a rough direction. But we'll see at the end how this actually creates a new role that I think is critical for the industry and actually makes things easier for everybody else. And that's key, because if it made it harder for everybody else, I'd think I'd give up, because there'd be no point to what I'm doing. But I believe this approach can make it easier for everybody except for a few people who know how to wield this. So let's learn, keep going. So this is a fundamental view of the world. This is continuing Alexander's. It says that when you build a thing, you can't build it in isolation. You can't decide on a team in isolation, but must repair the world around it. I know that sounds funny, but must look at how it relates and within it, so that the larger world at that one place becomes more coherent, more whole, and the thing which you makes takes its place in the web of nature as you make it. He talks about the quality without a name, the web of nature, how things are, how things come to life. And you can see this in architecture very apparent. Imagine like a Swiss village, or whatever really pretty, something Italian actually has got amazing villages. And imagine you see how that's been built up, where everything was built in the context of the things around it. Now imagine a sprawling complex of California, I hate to say it, Washington. I live in Washington, townhomes where they're just, obviously they just said, we got these 5 models, intersperse them, and it looks like crap. I don't quite work in that area. They do look similar, but at least each one was uniquely placed on the landscape, which is nice. But this is the difference. You have to pay attention to it. In short, each part is given its specific form by its existence in the context of the larger whole. So we have this whole part. That's quite good. But everything else fits within that. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have autonomy. Of course, you can have autonomy within the whole as long as you fit in the whole, which makes a lot of sense when you think about it. Why would you want a team working in a way against everybody else? But why would you want the way you have to work across the whole impact the team to work in a way that doesn't work for them? We're not dealing with this issue in the industry, and we're wondering why we're having troubles. It's easy why we're having troubles. So what does this tell us? Well, you can't build a good system from its pieces. You've got to work together. How do they relate to each other? This should not be a surprise, actually, but it kind of isn't being followed. So I've created what I call an Amplio pattern set. I got 2 of them. I'm going to talk about the bigger one. It's about 40 or 50 of them. And this is a quote from Tom Gill. I should mark it as this comes from a conversation I had with him. So I may not be getting the words right, but the intention is there. The critical key to all fruitful improvement is a set of clear quantified objectives. Now, quantified means you've got a way to measure it. It doesn't mean a number on it, okay? Your strategies for meeting these objectives must then be estimated and later measured to determine the dynamic set of objectives efficiently and continuously. The Amplio patterns are such a set that have been discovered to be essential parts of an organization's ability to improve its value delivery ability. I created these. Now, are they the right ones? I'd be the first one to tell you, of course not. I see a few people in the ACE program. They'll tell you, they repeatedly tell me they're the wrong set. That's how we improve them. I have some people who kind of focus on what I left out, and I got other people who seem to focus on what I did wrong. I love both groups. I kid them about it, and they know they're loved by me. Why? Because that's how you learn. You learn by having multiple people looking. We're building this as a community, but I guess I should say we're first identified. And I use these to build a flex system that's the heart of the DA Value Stream Consultant Workshop by the PMI. I've since taken it way beyond this with the ACE program. But you can create your own. You can take what I have and extend it. Well, I'm not sure I've made mine public, but if you are in the ACE program, you can take them and do that. Now, I'm just going to show you a few examples organized. And they're organized around the value stream because remember, the different parts of the system interact with each other. I'm taking Alexander's idea that things interact with each other, and therefore I'm going to look to see how do strategies, budgeting, portfolio management interact with product management, interact with customer experience. Now, those who've been in the ACE program will know I've been really sweating blood over getting the right set. And a couple days ago, it occurred to me, Al, you are so OCD at times. And why did I say that? Because I said, there is no right set. No wonder I keep moving it around. And I don't even need to give an ACE the right set. Because if you get a set that's about 80% correct, and if they understand how to tell what's good and not, then they can fill it in themselves. Remember what I said about the safe? Trying to give everything. So I've kind of relaxed. Those of you in the program will see this next week because we have a session on this. But I want to give you the idea that I've organized it by like, what are strategies? Notice how they influence product management, the customer experience. It's not critical to get them all. There's an intake process. Some companies don't really have one. The intake process for a company that doesn't have an intake process is just stuff comes in and nobody knows what's going on. That is actually the intake process. It's just not a defined intake process. Maybe I should say defined intake process. Would be a good idea. Development structure, quality. The idea is to use the list as a starting point, okay? Now, I'm not going over all these. I just want you to know that such a set does and can exist, and you can make your own. And the way I got these, okay, the purpose of these, and then I'll tell you the way I got these. I thought I said it, I'd probably have it on a later slide, but I'll tell you how I got these. The key is to find a set that provides for an adaptive framework. So an adaptive framework, I'll jump ahead since I mentioned the term here, is a framework that can adjust. It give you a starting point, but adjust. But let me tell you how I got these. I should put that here. I got these from around 2006. I think that's about when I started, maybe 2005. So I used to go to conferences a lot. I've kind of given up on it for a variety of reasons. I found that the more innovative I was, the less I was likely to get to go to the conference. At least a couple of them that way. But I used to go to them a lot. I mean, like, 10 to 15 conferences a year, and I did this for years. And when I would go to a conference, I might have, in having gone to over 1,000 conferences, might have gone to 5 talks. But that wasn't because I didn't want to talk to people. No, I wanted to talk to people who were attending the conference. So I'd be out in the hallway. I'd be talking to other speakers who weren't talking at the moment. I'd be talking to practitioners. I would set up booths saying, hey, you want to come talk to me? Come talk to me here. And I'd have interviews and I would talk and talk and talk and talk in every conference. Who knows? I must talk to 100 people. Just a lot. I don't know how many people I talked to, but it was thousands. And what I would ask them, I wasn't trying to sell them anything. What I would ask them is what were they doing, what worked and what didn't work. And sometimes they wanted to come to me to give ideas, and then I talk to them about what they can do and how they can get better. Now, this is anecdotal, I understand. But over the years, talking to thousands of people, I found patterns of what worked and what didn't work. I don't mean patterns like this. I mean just recurring themes. I found recurring themes of what worked and what didn't work. Now, what I started noticing was that there were some things you just needed to do. And what was surprising, at least to me, was that if you cut across multiple companies, most companies needed to do the same things. Not how, the what and the why. You needed clarity. You needed to work on the right stuff. You needed to work on little things. You needed to get value out. You needed to stop creating waste. And people would implement them differently. And what I also noticed was that the companies that were successful had somebody who understood principles like Reinertson's product development flow that he gives, second generation lean product development. They understood what he was talking about. They understood some aspects of Evo, but people hadn't put it all together. So they were struggling with it. Yes, thank you, Andrew. And that there was this kind of consistency. And those that needed more, well, there were usually 2 or 3 camps there. There was like, if they worked with other companies or vendors, or if they had hardware involved, or if they had some sort of financial or health regulation, something like that. So I started putting these together and I came up with a system that at the time I called Flex. I don't remember what I called it. It was back in, actually I came up with a variety of things at Net Objectives. And then when I went to the PMI, I created the Flex system inside the AVSC. So that's what these patterns are. So they're not new, even though I'm talking about them in a new way. They're not new. I've been doing this for years. But there are two truths we need to attend to in using these. One is people do need a well-defined set of practices they agree to follow. This is why people like frameworks. You got to accept that. They like them, and for a good reason. But no one approach works for everybody. Oh, bummer. And no one shell works for everybody. In other words, you can't say, oh, well, we're not telling anybody what to do. We're just telling them to plan out a couple of weeks or a week or whatever. You're still telling them how to plan out. Or we need to be cross-functional. Well, sure, cross-functional is great. Solves many, many problems. Or you have an art. Well, okay, that doesn't solve a lot of problems, but it solves a lot of other problems. No. Well, we need our adaptive frameworks. Now, I don't know if I made up this term. I think I did. But it's I'll explain it. I think you understand what I mean. So an adaptive framework provides a fit for purpose starting point. In other words, it adapts to you. Now, of course, you need some level of disruption, but that doesn't mean you need a lot. Sometimes there are different approaches. You can have very little disruption. You can have a lot of disruption. So a fit for purpose means maybe it's disruptive, maybe it's not disruptive. That's a variation. It attends to the rate, scope, and depth of change that can be accommodated by the organization. I've gone into places where they don't like to change at all. I've gone into places where they love to change. You can change too little or too fast and you'll cause problems. So how the adaptive framework has to attend to this. It provides a future target to improve to. It's adjustable as needed. But it is fixed at the moment, so people know what to do. And it can be adjusted as they gain proficiency and their needs change. Okay, this is important. Okay. So what we want to do is actually turn the Amplio patterns into an improvement path. In other words, and this is part of what we teach in the ACE program, is that, for each pattern, so I've got these 40, 50 patterns, you added some, you've taken some away, and you want to challenge what challenge is there in meeting the objective. If it's in scope, because some things are out of scope, so we're not going to fix that. You do this collaboratively. In other words, you don't tell people what's going on. You work with them to see all this and decide what to do. It can be done regardless of what the company's currently doing. Remember, it's where they are. So if they're doing safe, Scrum and Scale, whatever, it's okay. You can do that. And when you do this, when you say, well, here's where you are, here's the patterns, here's what you need to adjust, here's what you'd like to do best, here's how you implement this, or how you will implement this, you now have an improvement path. Some people call this a improvement backlog. In fact, that's kind of what at one time I think I called it, but I don't really like calling it a backlog because it's not quite a backlog. I called it a path because a path kind of implies it's going to change, and that's a good thing. And so this is step one. You're halfway there, but step one. In other words, you've got the things you've got to do. You see where you are with it, and now you've got to keep going. So how do you do that? So step two is determining which of the patterns we need to improve, which we've kind of identified them individually, but remember, you've got to work as a whole. What improvements use? The result of this creates our adaptive framework. In other words, if you've got this list, just stop and think about this. You've got this list of things, and you have the objective, the what, the why. Now you got to figure out the how and what order you're going to do. So how do I know how to do this? Well, this is the other thing I've been working on forever. I mean, my main breakthrough in this came around 2019 when I read The Choice by Ellie Goldratt, because I was so close, but I'd been close for like years. It didn't quite click until I read this, where Goldratt talks about if we dive deep enough, we'll find that there are very few elements at the base, the root causes, which through cause and effect connections are governing the whole system. Now, I knew that, but reading it in this clear, concise way, I mean, oh, this is what I've been writing about, is these few causes Well, what are they? Okay. Now I frame them as questions, and I'm going to just quickly go over them. This is again something, by the way, I call this Lean Foundations. I have a webinar on this, and I'm actually in the process of creating I had a mural board for it, but I've actually decided to make a booklet on what I call Amplio Foundations, which goes about first principles, strategies, and this. So this will be available via either the ACE program or the free Amplio Community of Practice. Okay, I'm working on it there, and it'll be a booklet, a workbook that explains it and then lets you write down what you know that self-teaches you in the workbook. Okay, and then you could share it on the ACOP, which is free, or join the ACE program and have more interactions. So in other words, you've got to know what you're doing. This should be self-evident when you think about it. The ones I'm going to show you, I think, are pretty clear. The question you might have is, are they sufficient? And they're not complete, no question. Have we identified our stakeholders? Do we know? So are they going to help us? Are we motivated? Do we know what their success criteria is? Are we working on the most valuable items? Or we have these huge epics working on stuff that's somewhat important, but stuff that's not important? We building the right product in the right way? Have we designed and optimized our processes to minimize waiting? This involves a whole bunch of stuff. Workload, work in process, value creation structure. Are people odor? This is what we want to avoid. What's causing this? It's very clear when you start paying attention to these principles, what's causing overload. Are we getting feedback? People talk about complexity, but let me tell you, to me, that's a red herring. Get fast feedback, complexity won't bother you. Even in simple systems, you can have disasters. Why? Just a simple misunderstanding. I love Bertrand Russell's, I think it was him, maybe it was somebody else. He said the biggest problem with communication is we think it's taken place. Not sure. Robert Shaw, I think Robert Shaw actually said that. But anyway, it's a great quote, whoever said it. Both those two are great. Is there a focus on cost-effective continuous improvement? Typically not. One of the things, Andrew, I love about how buildings learn is he talks about this a lot, about the difference between improving something or questioning your assumptions about improving something, or how do you learn? Brilliant conversation about these learning models. Are we managing the ecosystem and not micromanaging the people? See, this is something systems thinking tells us. System thinking tells us that most of what's going on is due to the system. So when there are problems, it's not the people's fault, it's the system. That doesn't get them off the hook, by the way, because the people are responsible for the system. But it says, look there. As an agile coach, you've got to look at that. Okay. Is all work in process visible? That includes how it's being done. Okay. So I'm about to summarize. I know I've said a lot. Maybe it hasn't all come together. I'm going to try to do that in the Amplio GPS. That's what I call this. Takes you from where you are to where you want to be, and it does it through a way of not predetermined. Continuously evaluate your target and your path. Okay, it's not preordained, but one that you create. Okay, so let's go through what let's put together. I know I've dumped a lot of stuff, but let me put it together in a more succinct way. First, get clear on your objectives. Talk to find the executive sponsors. What are their success criteria? What are their values? Make sure you know who's involved. Make sure they're motivated. Okay. Identify your challenges. Okay, now how you do this? Well, actually, I have different boards to do it. There are lots of ways. Most people actually know what their challenges are. One way to do it is just list them out. What I do is I have what I call a generic value stream, like something that illustrates, what are the steps from the start to the end if you did it not right or well, but just like, strategies, product management, intake process, development, ops, and just lay out your challenges. It's not hard to do. People very much know it's kind of in their face. Create an improvement. Well, I showed you how to do that, but let me recap. Start with the Amplio patterns or make your own. If you don't like mine, that's fine. Make your own. What are the things that need to be done? What are the objectives? Make a list. How are they doing that? Then look to see what's the rate, the scope, what's the rate, the scope, the depth you need to go that you can go. Mark that, and then create an improvement path. Now, I wish I could go into detail on all the how you do this, but I mean, give me a break. It's an hour. But this is what you can learn in a lot of the streams I put out on YouTube. This is actually the heart of the ACE program. is this as well. Okay. You iteratively implement the path. Okay, now I'm going to put the benefits is you get something that works for you. Now, admittedly, how hard is this? Well, I admit it takes more for an ace or someone who can do this to know how to do this. But think of it from the people's perspective using it. They now have a well-defined path. They know what they're getting. They know what they have to do. It's been defined. You've got it all documented in this thing. It's fit for purpose. And they also feel included because a good consultant would talk to them when this comes into existence. It's not predetermined, so it definitely is fit for purpose. Now, does it take more to wield this? Yes. But here's another cool thing, and this is an option. And I've done this before. Part of the Amplio patterns is like a preset model. You know how you get a radio and you can have the buttons pushed to, oh, you like country? Well, I put all the country stations on here. Well, the same way, just have you could take these patterns and say, oh, you want to do safe? Great. Then do this, and this. Because safe has most of these, or they ignore some of them. But, and they have some that I don't think you need to worry about. But you can have presets. If you want a preset, great, preset. Here's the Amplio patterns preset for safe. Here's the Amplio patterns preset for combat. Here's the Amplio patterns preset for Scrum at Scale. Because I actually came up with something that predates Scrum at Scale, like by about 8 years. I call it BLAST, basically an Agile Solutions team that's embedded in there. So having a quick, easy start can be done just as well. Just preset. That's what I'm trying to avoid, but there's no reason you can't do it if that's important to you. And sometimes it is actually. Sometimes that's useful, but you might want to put in a couple options. So anyway, here's my invitation to you. We're actually just starting this next week, so now is perfect timing. It really is a program that doesn't end. But I cover almost all the material of basically what you could consider to be in a Scrum at Scale and advanced team level course, the DAVSC, and a coaching class in about 6 months. It takes that long to go through the whole thing. We're kind of expanding it. It also has built-in Q&A. By the way, those of you who are in the Amplio community practice, which is free, and those of you who aren't but are listening to this and want to join, the ACOP is free. Go to successengineering.org, just take learning journeys. This one here takes you straight to the ACE program. And you join the ACOP, and then on Thursday morning sessions, you can come and ask questions for free. So if you read stuff as I'm putting it out there, you can do that. This also gives a chance for the ACEs to kind of show what they know. So sometimes you'll get answers from me, sometimes you'll get answers from them. That's an opportunity. And this again starts next week. Okay, so we got a few minutes left, which was my intent, but also is my surprise that I did this. Raise hands, questions, I'll call on you or put things in the chat. I have a hard time believing this was that clear, that there are no questions. I'm more concerned it just went over everybody's head, except I know some people here are familiar with this.
All right, just to clarify, Al.
Yeah.
Did you say you were giving an example of how there was a team and then the organization would change around it, the system would change around it? I thought you said it's okay for them to stay as they are. Isn't the purpose of the organization changing around them so that they would have, better environment to work in better? Or did I misunderstood what?
No, you didn't misunderstand. It's a great question. So there are different kinds of change you can do to an organization. One way, this was promoted mostly by Dave Anderson when he came up with the Kanban method. Kanban method is different from Kanban. Kanban method says start exactly where you are and make very minor changes. Uses what's called Kaizen, little changes. The Toyota Kata is an example of this. So there are two approaches and then two extremes and then individual approaches. The other one is say to start with safe and just put everything out there. So one's disruptive and one's not disruptive. Which one should you use? Well, I'm a consultant, so my answer is it depends, and it does depend, but I'll tell you what it depends on. How are people in the company going to accept the changes? How well are they going to see it? And how well do you know what the changes should be? So what I'm suggesting is when you're making a decision on an improvement path, you need to pay attention to how disruptive do you want to be? How big of a change can you be? So sometimes you will say, hey guys, we really have to change here. Now, if you're being incredibly dysfunctional, then it may require a big change. I've gone into companies that had no intake process at all. Well, we wouldn't do a little change like, well, for these, we'll start making track, but we wouldn't necessarily make it a great big change. I remember one company I went in and says, well, we're not going to change your intake process, except that when something comes in, you have to tell this manager and she'll keep a list. Now, that was a small change, but now people had visibility and now they could see what's actually going on in the company. Believe it or not, they had no idea what was going on in the company. They could just go to each individual team and ask them what they were working on. Now, after they started doing that, that opens up other opportunities. Well, maybe we ought to prioritize these, okay? So one way in some companies, it would be you just start tracking, then you start prioritizing, or then maybe you start, well, let's make things smaller. Some companies will say, well, we're too messed up and we've got urgency and we've got to go fast. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to implement a intake process where we work on the smallest things we can that add value, and we're going to prioritize it. That's a big change. Now, which one's right? It's a stupid answer if you say which one's right without looking at what's going on. What you want to do is which one is correct for the company, where you want to go as far as you can, but not too far. Did that answer your question, Karen? You're still on mute. You're still on mute.
I understand what you said. I don't think I totally understood. Like the team is doing something not good, and then the organization changes around it.
I'm sorry. I misunderstood your question. I get it now. Now, what I said, what I meant, I answered a different question than you asked. Apologies. So what I was saying is that organizations need to talk about how across the organization people are going to work together. In other words, are we going to have, if we're going to have planning every month, then everybody has to be ready to plan or say what we're doing. So that kind of thing might make sense in an organization. Or if we're going to say we have different teams working together, so we have to be clear on what the definition of done is so different teams can understand. So there's that across the board agreement of how different teams can work together. Okay, that is, I'm saying that is true. But now within that context, how do the teams work individually? Well, that's up to the team, but they have to do it in the same way that we're saying the organizations work together. For example, and I've seen this, like say the company says, well, we're using Jira, okay. And for all the grief Jira gets, and most of the time it's well-deserved, Jira can be done right. I've seen people use Jira, but they usually have a dedicated person to set up. So let's say though you've got some tool that the company says everything's got to go into. Well, that's fine. You have to keep your reporting cadence. That doesn't mean the team has to use that tool day to day. That just means they have to update it day to day as the company demands. Or if there's going to be weekly get-togethers on what to build, that's great. You've got to go to those meetings. But within the team, you can figure out if I want to use a flow model or not. Maybe I can use Kanban at a team. Maybe I can use Scrum at a team. That's what I meant. It's like you're saying how do you behave within the company, but as long as you behave within the company this way, you can do whatever you want to in your own space.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for asking. Okay, we still got time for another question.
I have a question for you, Al.
Sure.
One of the criticisms towards techniques like Scrum that work mostly on the team level and try to kind of permeate through the organization bottoms up is that it just doesn't scale, or you can't expect it to bottom up, make those changes that are necessary. So with an adaptive framework, which level of the company do you think as a consultant you should focus on the most when you come into a company that has some dysfunction to start sort of this change into paying attention to the right metrics and working better together, even if not everyone is working the same way? Would you say it's more middle management, or is it executives, or do you start in one corner and hope that will sort of infectiously sort of grow everywhere else? How would you generally approach that?
Yeah, I like to start as high up as I can, because the higher up you are, the more sponsorship you have and the more revenue to fund it. I don't mean fund me as a consultant. I mean fund the programs and the changes and the patients. What seems to work well, though, is you get sponsorship where you say, okay, we're going to do this from at the executive level. That doesn't mean they have to have hands-on. In fact, it's usually better they don't. They're too busy. But mid-management needs to take responsibility. Now, that's what I like. I have gone into places where it's just at the team level. The problem is if you're working at the team level, you've got to recognize you're solving team level problems, not inter-team level problems. Scrum pretends that you can take the solutions you have at the team level and use them at inter-team level, and that's a mistake. It doesn't work that way. I've written about this for like 15 years or longer even. It's kind of frustrating. This is why Scrum is Scrum as it was originally defined, and everybody got gung-ho about it for years and years and years. Didn't work. We came up with something we called the product coordination team, where we coordinated product definitions and what was needed and spread it across teams. It was the precursor to Blast and then later Scrum at Scale that has at least a higher view. So I like to start as high as you can. If the problem is mid-management doesn't understand what's going on, trying to get it to grow from the bottom up isn't going to work very well. You'll get the teams working fine, but you won't get value at the door. Should not be a surprise. But systems thinking is not very prevalent in the Agile space, I hate to say. So here's the other interesting thing. I've gone into some places where simply the idea of you're only working on things that are going to give you value. I've seen managers take that and transform organizations of 300, 400 people just with that one concept. Only work on things of value. So the higher up you are, you can start in the value stream, the better off you are. There's something to pay attention here. I'm going to go back to these slides on the Amplio patterns. What's important to pay attention to is how these impact these, impact these, impact these. It kind of flows downstream. If you have too many big items going into the development team, that's going to impact them. So you can start lower, not lower in the hierarchy, but I mean further down in the value stream, and then show how it impacts you further by making decisions upstream. In other words, how do I have to change my development organization? If I can go a product to product, I shift from project thinking to product thinking in my product management and use minimum business increments or MVPs or things like that, I can positively impact. But if I'm starting here, then I have to show how you're negatively impacting me by not doing this stuff. So it's not a right place to start. See, this is why people really aren't that interested in maybe this approach. It's tougher for somebody to wield it, but let's go back to why I said this is so important. If you have the how to convey, this is again why I integrate 3 different tracks in the ACE program now. And ACE has to learn, good consultant has to learn the what and the why. The how is easy, but you also have to learn how to convey. Just knowing these isn't enough. That's why I have 3 tracks. One track's on basically this and this, the other track's on this, the other track's on this. You need all of them. Part of the key of the GPS is to figure out where you start and how high up you can start, and then how do you go from there. This is an interesting thing, and I admit this was a little bit of a surprise to me, but fortunately I've got some people who push back on me all the time when I hadn't paid attention to it, is even talking to management. I now have 3 different places to start in talking to them because it depends where they are. Some companies don't have any intake process at all. You got stuff coming in, going to development. Well, you got to start talking to them at that level. Some people have a pretty well-defined intake process, but it's a many marketing people to many development teams. Well, then start there. Some have a better structure So there's mainly these three different areas have a better structure, but they have challenges throughout. Okay, well, we've run out of time. I do suggest that at a minimum, if you want more, and you don't have a budget, join the ACOP, go to successengineering.works, take the learning journeys, and then that's the place to ask questions. There'll be more stuff there. But what I'm really doing to kind of so I can focus more on the ACE program is what I've done. Instead of having a separate material program in the ACOP, I'm letting them come in Thursday mornings asking questions. Okay. But the ACOP is fairly extensive. It's got tracks. It's really 5 hours a week. And I don't expect anybody to do all of it every week, but everything's recorded and you can kind of go and do as you want. I really expect people to stay in there. There's more stuff I haven't even gotten here. You get virtual collaboration boards and a variety of PowerPoints. Okay, so thanks for being here. If you got questions, you can also remember my email. I'll jump to it at the front, successengineering.works. Please send me emails, follow me on LinkedIn, and take care.